Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming this afternoon, and welcome to the Dream Exchange Introduction to Small Business Valuation. Without further ado, let me start. And like I said, just be assured that your takeaways today, we're willing to work with you. If you have more questions, if you need more information, we have an entire staff of people ready to answer questions after the webinar. So just be patient, and hopefully you'll get some real value out of today. One of the things I wanted to cover today, very early on in my career, I began to realize that mechanical valuations are not something the average business owner is intimately familiar with. Very often the business owner, and rightfully so, is focused on meeting milestones, on making the next sale, on getting the prototype to work, on all the operational considerations that go into the day-to-day life of you as a small business owner. So what we're going to introduce you to is the single most important way to look at your business, not necessarily now, but in the future. Now, there's valuation types. What you see on the screen right now are five different types of valuation that are commonly used by valuation experts. So, for example, we have what's called capitalization of earnings. There's specific mathematical formulas behind valuation by capitalization of earnings, or what they call discounted future earnings. And then there's the multiple area. So price to earnings multiple, price to revenue multiple, price to free cash flow multiple. These are just five. Now, we have a product at the Dream Exchange called the Strategic Plan, or Strat Plan. In that product, when you come and work with us, we'll not only do all five of these valuations for you, we do about four other types. And those valuation types are very mechanical, and they're based upon generating a lot of profitability. And if you think about that, if you're a small business owner and you're not yet profitable, then it would appear that these are not really workable solutions, right? You're earning $100,000 or $200,000, and how can you use discounted future earnings where an analyst comes and applies a discount rate or an interest rate to the future and tries to determine today, in present time, what the future value of all those earnings is? It's a very, very difficult equation. In fact, most of these equations become almost irrelevant to valuation as it pertains to the small business owner. So you should just know, and if you want to do your own research, that's great. If you want to get some more education on these types of valuations, we're happy to provide them to you. And there's a lot of mechanics, a lot of financial calculations that go along with this. However, what's important to know is you have to, if you're raising capital or you're looking to sell your business to a single buyer, what's really important to know is what's in the mind of the person who's going to invest or going to buy. And for many years of my career, I was the lawyer representing those people. I was what was considered to be the buy-side lawyer, meaning the investor or purchaser needed legal counsel, and it was really up to me how we went about looking at value. And I discovered very early on that, at least for most of the businesses I was working with, that these were not really workable solutions. So I want you to be aware that these types exist, and we can go through them in detail. We're not going to do that today, but the awareness that they exist really only applies to certain businesses that are a bit larger and maybe perhaps a bit larger in scope. So what should you be looking at? So one of the things that you should be looking at is, what is the most common valuation that an investor is looking at when it comes to a small business? And that most common valuation is the price to earnings, or earnings multiple. And it's a very important calculation to understand. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on that today, because it's very important for you to know that there's two aspects of that. One is the quantity of the earnings. How much money does your business make? That's very, very important. It's very important to the investor. It's very important to you, because without earning money, obviously you're not going to survive. So quantity is one of the key factors. But even more important for you as a small business is something called the quality of the earnings. Now, quality takes all kinds of different shapes and forms. In other words, if your business is generating income from being a dry cleaners, well, you can generate a lot of dollars. You can generate a quantity of dollars. But the quality of the earnings in the dry cleaning industry, you're going to need a very creative business model to improve the valuation of the business because it's very well known. It's easily calculated. It's comparable to many other businesses. And investors generally are not just hot to go and invest, no offense to dry cleaners, but to the neighborhood dry cleaning business. So the quality of earnings pertains to you and what you're creating. What are you creating inside the business? Now, before you can look at quality of earnings, you really should understand the mechanics of how to convert the investor's mind from a rate of return into a valuation multiple. Now, the word rate is of tantamount importance here. Rate is movement through time. So all things happen at a rate. Water comes out of a spigot at a rate. We move through our vehicles at a rate of speed. Rate is a very important part of this, and time is of the utmost importance to you as a business owner. So in the mechanics, the investor wants to assign a percentage, a rate. How fast will I recuperate my money? And if I make the investment, how fast will it grow? So having said that, when you look at what exactly is an earnings multiple, what is the definition of an earnings multiple as it applies to small business? Actually, this applies to large businesses as well. An earnings multiple can be defined as what a willing investor pays to purchase $1 of a company's earnings. So for example, if the earnings multiple is 7, then if the earnings multiple is 7 and the earnings are $10, and let's just say it's a public company, the willing investor would be willing to pay $70 for 1 share of the company's stock. So it's a very simple mathematical calculation, right? So $1 of earnings times some arbitrary multiple at the moment equals the value they're willing to give you. Now you can extrapolate this that if your business earns $1 million and the earnings multiple is 7, they would be willing to pay you $7 million to purchase the entire business because it's all of your earnings. That's usually more applicable to a small business. So if you have $1 million that you earn each year, you could argue that I would like to sell the business for 7 times the earnings. Now, earnings here means after all of your expenses. It doesn't mean that the amount of revenue you generate. It doesn't mean the margin you generate after revenue. It's the bottom line. What is the investor going to take away if he buys the whole company? So earnings really is the bottom line. Some people define that as net profit, but there are other calculations which in future webinars we'll go through in great detail. And suffice it to say for right now that it's the net number of what you are taking away from your business. Now, when you look at that earnings multiple, there are some key factors in the mind of the investor. And what is the investor thinking about? He's thinking about his risk. His thoughts are, if I invest X number of dollars and I'm paying for this whole business, what rate of return should I have to receive in order to recuperate my investment? Because I need to get a higher return if I'm taking a higher risk. This is the most common evaluation of business. High risk should equal high reward. We're going to dedicate an entire future webinar to just that concept. But for now, you should understand that that's what they're thinking. They're thinking that the greater the perceived risk, then the lower they want to pay, because the chances are they're going to lose all of their money. So how do they mitigate against that? How do they protect themselves if they're going to take a big risk? Well, at that point, they have to lower the price, right? They don't want to risk as much money taking a big chance. They still want to get a big rate of return. So what you see mathematically here is, for example, and I think it's a little bit cut off in our slide, but where an investor sees the risk being quite high, he may argue, I need to get a 35% rate of return. So that's that 35 you see in the left box. Well, if you take 35 and you assume that 100% risk that you lose all your money is there. Well, 35 into 100 equals 2.9. That's a multiple. This is how the multiple is calculated using a risk-based model. If he perceives the risk to be a bit lower, then he'll demand a lower rate of return, and he's willing to pay more for the business. So if he has the viewpoint that he's not that risky, he's going to make more money on this by spending a little bit more money of investment, well, he might only want a 17% rate of return. So 17 into a 100% loss is 5.8. So if you look at this, and this is generally true even today, that if you look at these rate of return expectations, the multiple of earnings that an investor generally pays for a mature business, meaning you've been in business for several years, usually more than 3 years, and you're a private business and you have a reasonable amount of earnings, meaning that you're in more than $500,000 up to $2 million, generally they're going to evaluate your business looking at you between about 2.8 and 5.8, or 3 to 6. That's going to be your earnings multiple. So simply put, if you look at your business in the simplest of all contexts, and you say, well, I make $1 million a year and I'm a great dry cleaners, the likelihood of risk in that is going to be quite high, and the likelihood is that the investor or purchaser is going to pay a lower multiple. You may be only at 3. Now, if you go into a bank, they're going to use a very similar calculation. On the other hand, the risks at the bank are so much higher that a bank will generally not value more than 2 times your earnings if you're getting a loan. So investors will pay a little bit more, but in general, this is the actual calculation, and this is how they calculate it. What's really important about it is you have to look at what the alternative to the investor's investment is. In other words, if the investor is choosing your business versus investing in perhaps a stock on the stock exchange, well, that's a very certain investment many times. Apple Computer, IBM, very large corporations, well, they pay, and the growth of the company provides a fairly high rate of return and a bit lower risk, because guess what? If they don't like the investment, they can instantly sell it. So the factors that go in to calculating that percentage, that rate of return, have the subject of an entire other webinar. But I want you to first understand the calculations, because once you understand the calculation, then you yourself can start applying this to the direction and the plans you make for your business. So 35% to 17% is a mature business that's profitable and that has been in existence for quite some time. Now, if you haven't been in business that long, or you don't have that much profitability, imagine that the investor is going to want a 40, 50, 60% rate of return. Venture capitalists want a 100% rate of return. They want to double their money. So you have to begin to look at, how could I persuade that investor to give me a fair value to my business, even though he's expecting a very high rate of return from my business? And if you're not generating a lot of cash flow every month and every year, well, you really need to do your work to get that earnings multiple up. Now, some of you may not even be profitable. Some of you may have a 0 earnings. So obviously anything times 0 is 0, right? But there's a way, as I keep indicating, this is going to be a series of webinars, not everything you need to know in one. But this first webinar, understanding this model, is of very, very important data, because most investors and most analysts and most lawyers who are going to look at your business are going to think in these equations. So having said that, now you have to look at, where can I start? How can I increase my valuation? And there are really 3 starting points. The first point is, what's the value of my company today? In other words, do I have a $100,000 earnings, and how can I get that up? Because today, $100,000 in earnings may not give you a tremendous mathematical value. So the value of your company today using this model is going to be quite low. So the second thing, however, is, what is the investor or buyer thinking about this return. In other words, if you have lower earnings, you really need to consider that the buyer or investor makes the investment for strategic reasons rather than these mathematical reasons. You need to shift your own mindset to all of the various plans you have. So strategic plan is the product that we're talking about, or strat plan. This is the beginning of making the investor understand that you have to minimize the profitability of my business today because it's enormously valuable. A good example of that, it's probably the best example that we all know of, is Tesla Motors. Tesla Motors posted its first quarter of profitability in the company's history last quarter. But why is it the most valuable company in the automotive industry? Well, they weren't really concentrating on earnings multiples. No one was looking at that investment and looking at its value through the eyes of a mechanical calculation. The investor or buyer who invests in Tesla knows for sure that the value is there because they own something really valuable, the ability to mass produce electronic cars. So now you can begin to think, what is my business doing that will be persuasive to an investor to minimize the effects if you don't have a lot of earnings? Now, there are other techniques that we're going to show you, but that's a simple question, and it's something that you can exhaustively do in your planning. In fact, you should be exhaustively doing this for your business all the time. And I understand most small business owners are busy working in the business, and they don't take a lot of time, even for a webinar like this, to work on the business. You have to consider yourself, even if you're very small, as the CEO of a very large company someday. And what you own will become very important to the technique of valuation, even if it's going to take you a long time to become profitable. And you have to be able to steer the conversation with that investor into their mindset. Why would they want your particular business? Why would they want to own it? Why would they want to strategically become partners with you? Or why would they invest in it, knowing that at the moment it's not going to pay them an enormous amount of cash dividends? If they just want cash dividends, they can buy an apartment building and charge higher rent. So if you're an entrepreneur, you have to begin to think about milestones. Now, in this webinar and all the future webinars, I'm going to be talking about milestones, and then I'll talk about milestones again. And if I forget to mention it, it's going to be a milestone-based pricing model that we're going to train you in the future webinars. But if you don't understand these mechanics, eventually the milestone-based pricing, the milestone-based valuations won't work unless you at least have your eye on the mechanics that I just gave you. And the last thing I've kind of already touched on it is, how can we create the optimal expansion targets to create an ideal exit and enterprise value and eventually liquidity? I touched upon the dream exchange. Liquidity is also a really important term for you to understand, because private investments generally are illiquid. That means that once the investor has invested his money in you, his only way to recuperate the investment is either you're vastly profitable, or you can both then resell the business for a higher value. That's where liquidity comes, the cash eventual return to the investor. The investor doesn't invest $1 to get $1 or less back. He invests $1 to get $1 or more back someday. Now there's time again, someday. So what can you be doing to create that optimal expansion today? What can you do now to make sure that your business plan is what the investor invests in? And that's the primary investment tool. They invest in your future plans. So if you think about where you are today, what's the value today? Well, if you have a lot of incomplete milestones and you're not even approaching them, that's going to be very difficult, because then you have to persuade the investor that you can do it. In addition, if you're not profitable, the money he invests or she invests is going to be used up towards accomplishing those milestones. So you have to be very persuasive that their invested dollar is going to help you make the products that you're creating become extremely valuable in the market, just like Tesla. All those funds that have been invested in Tesla for all these years have gone into a production line to make mass-produced electronic cars. It's truly an innovation that no one before Tesla Motors ever created. It's extremely valuable. You should think of your business in terms of creating the value through the accomplishment of those milestones so that the value expands because you are the owner of your own creativity. You're the person who's the source of the imagination and ideas and creation of the business. And that can be equally as persuasive to the investor as a lot of cash flow. Now, you still have to be able to make those milestones and make that cash flow argument to your investor. So how is it that you're going to do that? How are you going to create those expansion plans? Now, there's something that's a bit theoretical, but I want you to make sure you look at it. You have to, and this is a discussion about how do you tell the investor the plan and get their agreement. The key to all of this information that you're getting is agreement. When an investor and the owner of a business agree upon the valuation, deals close. When there isn't an agreement on valuation, or there's a disagreement about the potential of the business, the deal doesn't close. Excuse me. When an agreement exists, we refer to that as an equilibrium. And there's an entire other webinar that's going to discuss equilibrium pricing. You're going to get an introduction to that today. Now, the theory behind this, and this is what is written on the screen, and these words are very significant, I guess, is the best term to use. The need to correctly plan for your expansion and exit. Exit being you sold your entire business or a portion of it. If you get an investor, he's going to purchase some part of the business. You are exiting. If you own less of your business, that's a form of exiting the business. You own less. So correctly planning expansion and exit is increased only as the best companies will successfully sell and the best companies get the highest value. And when I say best, you can be the best dry cleaners. And I've actually given specific examples because I've done dry cleaner deals. And if you have something different, something unique, something more able to convince that investor that your locations, your technology, your ability to do dry cleaning, and sorry to keep harping on the dry cleaner businesses, but it's all business of any type. If you can persuade them that you're the best, that you have something different and unique, you'll get your highest value. However, when you're looking for highest value, here's the entry of time. That only happens when you and the investor have a future. It's not today's value any longer. You look at today as a starting point, but you have to have a future, including your estimations. Your estimations that involve how long will it take to get the second location, how much money. And all of these go into a very, very detailed mechanical plan. That mechanical plan, as I keep alluding to, we actually have a model, a strategic planning model that will help you calculate without actually using profitability. You have to plan a future that includes estimation of the effort, meaning the energy, the human resources, the money resources, all of what it's going to take to get to that next milestone. When you can correctly estimate that, and you have a proven track record of estimating that, what you are really doing is starting an idea into motion. You're taking an idea which only exists in your mind, and you're putting it into action. Things are occurring. There's movement through space, and that involves time. The movement of your idea through space and time has to have a momentum. And the word momentum is synonymous with a rate. That's where the investor's looking at you and saying, what is the rate at which this will increase in value? What is its momentum? Is it very fast? Is it very slow? So it has to have a good idea that you've already set in motion, and then you have to estimate the momentum. And how much of the energy and resources are you going to need to continue to nourish it as if you were planting a seed? how much more water in the form of money, how much more human resources in the form of tending to that investment are going to be needed so that it flourishes. So once it's grown, you then have this obligation to recognize when it might decline. And this is what you're going to see in the coming slides and in the future webinars. It will go down. That's how life works. Things go up and down. Sales do not stay stagnant. Nothing stays motionless. And if you're not able to communicate when the down will happen, so you need more money, you need more people, you need more energy, then you're in trouble, because you may have to go and ask that investor for more money to continue to make those milestones. So you have to predict when it will decline, and especially you have to predict when, if ever, it will become obsolete. And the greatest example of that is no one today is buying buggies pulled by horses. It's an obsolete mode of transportation. And if everyone were trying to get investments into the horse and buggy business, I suggest to you that the alternative is Tesla Motors, and you're not going to get a lot of investors. And that's an extreme example, but I see many, many business owners not seeing that at some point they're going to become obsolete, that other things are going to replace what you're doing. So it's very important that you outline and bullet point the suggestions that are in this equation, because this is not necessarily the mathematics of it, but it will help you assign a rate. That rate the investor is looking for, and the higher the rate, obviously, the less value. Remember, a 35% rate of return gives you a valuation multiple of 3, whereas a 17% rate of return doubles your valuation multiple. So if you can predict very well that the rate will be quite good to the investor and that he has less risk in doing so, you can get a better multiple. So the concluding comment is you have to always be looking at expanding your scope. So the scope of a single line of products and its future has to be developed in such a way that multiple lines or multiple companies or acquisitions are capable of making your company very large. And there's going to be an entire webinar dedicated to a case study of a company that we helped, and they were very small. They only had about $1 million per year. And I mean, small, depending on who you are, maybe that sounds big to you, but $1 million in earnings. And we helped that company do this very technique, and they're actually traded on the NASDAQ stock exchange today. They're in the Russell 2000 index. How did we go from where this webinar introduction is right now to a company traded on the NASDAQ? Well, these non-financial factors that I'm giving you in this slide were of the utmost importance. So you need to carefully be able to list these out in a strategic plan and make them into financial equations. Okay, so how do we do that? And this is a very, very high-level overview of what we call equilibrium pricing technology. Now, it may look like a very busy graph, but right now, all of you, if you haven't already received funds from an investor, you're at the bottom there in what we call phase 1. Okay, it's preparation. You're trying to prepare to receive funds from an investor. And what you see are those two lines. You see where it says -3, -2, -1. Those are just arbitrary time periods. Maybe it's 3 years, maybe it's 3 months. But it's before you're approaching getting your first dollar from an investor. And if you are flat, if you have zero, if you're not profitable at all, you can still persuade an investor using the techniques I just gave you to giving you some money. When you get funds, your business will expand. It will go up. You see that curve of value. So the vertical line is the value of the business. The horizontal line is time. And really, those are the two most significant factors for you as a small business owner. How long will it take you to achieve your milestones? Now you see a yellow line. That yellow line kind of is very linear, right? It goes up and 1 and over 1 and up 1 and over 1. Most business owners that I've talked to over the years present me with a plan that always shows consistent upward movement. That line is just not true. It's not how business works. There are ups and downs. There are pandemics. There are all kinds of things that occur to business owners that make it difficult and sometimes impossible to have one up and one over. But if you're calculating according to that kind of curvy line that you see, and you say, if I get this money, I'm going to expand. But before I expand, so you see phase 2, which is called deployment. That means you've received your funds. And once you've received them, you're going to do something with them. You're going to spend them. And you have to be able to have a very careful plan of estimation. Again, estimation of the energy and resources. How much money will it take? How much human action is it going to take to move the line from lower to higher? Because as you make your milestones, the value of your business will go up. So what you see in that curve is a natural decline, because after you've spent all the money and you don't have the new sales and you don't have the new customers and the plant has not been completed, you necessarily will have a decline in the value mathematically. Remember, I showed you that earnings rate of return, the price to earnings multiple. It'll go down. And you should tell your investor it's going to go down. Because if you don't tell him, it comes as a surprise. Venture capitalists who see a decline in business become scared. And they often become very upset. And venture capital transactions often fail because the communication between the company owners or the source of creating the company and the investor hasn't been completely transparent. They have to tell the investor, look, after we spend all the money, we're going to be this far. What you see is that red line. It's kind of a width and a depth to the decline. Well, that's what we want to measure. It's the most important measurement for you as a business owner. How long will it take you to come out of that curve at the bottom? Once you receive the investment dollars, if that curve is very shallow and very steep up climbing, you can make a better deal for yourself. You can sell less of your company because the internal rate of return, or the rate that we discussed, is going to be optimized. So where you see inside the box, it says EP, that stands for equilibrium price. We're trying to optimize the conversation between you and your investor so they fully understand you've estimated the amount of time to get to the next level. And during that trough period, investors will be very patient. They were very patient with Tesla. The trough really almost never happened because they kept making milestones. The trough was very shallow and very narrow. That deployment phase is your entire plan, because as you deploy the funds and as you make milestones, that investor will be more persuaded. And guess what will happen? More investors will be persuaded. So you can achieve second, third, fourth rounds of funding. And as you are accomplishing those goals and coming out of that, you can see that red box. That's where you're shooting for. Generally, that's about 5 years away. So it takes 5 years of planning to close your funds in day 1 or day 0 on this graph. And what we will do is then provide you with mathematical ideas on how to minimize the ownership that the investor is going to get, or get it optimized, which we call the floor, and maximize it so that they get a reward for being patient with you, or a ceiling. Now, there are a number of other factors, but mathematically, we want to help you to calculate how you can do a valuation of your business on time 0, shooting for that red box. Now, this technique is within our strategic plan. This is the most important technique to preserving your life's work. If you've dedicated yourself to being an entrepreneur and developing a business, not doing this does a great disservice to everything you're creating. And I've seen it happen over and over. There's a wonderful company, actually a friend of mine, and that company became many hundreds of millions of dollars in value. And he received about $10 million, but he really didn't optimize this, and he really gave away the lion's share of a very valuable company at times zero. So we're trying to optimize how you put valuation in place using this technique that is going to be driven by, in that red box, is a price to earnings multiple. That's what we just discussed. So we're going to be using rates, we're going to be using earnings, we're going to be using the mathematics, but those mathematics are really based upon non-mathematical factors. What you're creating to own your business in the future is of great importance to the investor and to you. That's our technology. And I'm just going to check my time here. Good, I'm not too far over. But this is the subject of an entire other 1-hour webinar, but this is an introduction to it. You have to realize that most investors are going to be using the price to earnings multiple calculation that I gave you earlier on. And if you can use that and assign value to the milestones you make, you can increase your value and negotiate more favorable terms with your investors today. You can negotiate to sell your entire business for a higher valuation using this technique today. And obviously, phase 3 is what we call expansion. That's where everybody's really happy because the business is flourishing, prospering, and expanding. Well, our goal is to persuade the business owner and the investor both to a common agreement on where those equilibrium values exist in the future. That's the technique that's most important to small business valuation, because most small businesses on paper are going to lose money or they're going to be barely profitable. Now, if you're highly profitable today, that's great. And we can, if you're further along, we can use this exact same technique and amplify it using real actual calculations of earnings. But if you don't have those calculations, then this is the graph that you need to pay careful attention to. And like I said, we're going to go through another webinar where we're going to teach this in great detail. And these webinars I've presented this information in universities and MBA programs. This is a technique that is pulling in all of the varying valuation technologies that exist, so it's not unfamiliar to your investors or you as a business owner. On the other hand, what's really important for you to understand is that using this as the senior information and the senior most valuable thing you're going to do is continue to create the business. And it's hard to do. I've often said you're not a real entrepreneur until you've put your payroll on your credit cards. So we're your advocate. We're here to help you as a small business owner. We're also the advocate for the investor, because if a small business owner is using this technology, investors tend not to lose their money. So what we want to do is make sure that there's very pragmatic and real estimations that go into the formulas so that we can work towards an equilibrium on valuation for many years to come. So I made it under time, and I really look forward to you being in communication. I hope you're flourishing and prospering. I really hope you join our team and flourish and prosper with us. And we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar, which will be very, very, very soon. Have a great afternoon, everyone.